Welcome to this presentation of apostrophes. We're up on our fifth presentation, and this will be our first presentation on the second PowerPoint. We're more than halfway done, so we're getting near the conclusion. Please bear with me as we go ahead and finish up this, this task. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so this is a familiar screen. We're going to talk about the three ways that we use apostrophes in written English. We've already talked about the first one, to show possession or ownership using the genitive case. And we even talked about the exception, its. So number one, this first item is what we covered in our first series of presentations on apostrophes. Now we're up to number two, which is to show that a word is a contraction. That is our second main reason that we use apostrophes. And then we'll finally talk about number three later on, though not today, or not in this presentation. Okay, so this is our topic for today, to show that a word is a contraction. Okay, let me give a little bit of a disclaimer here. Everything I'm about to say you already know. This will be probably a pretty quick presentation. We won't have to spend a lot of time reflecting upon this. The reason why I go through in kind of a baby step way is to show how to unpack the knowledge about grammar. In most cases, an understanding of grammar requires lots of little pieces, lots of little steps. None of those steps individually are especially difficult. What happens is knowing the steps that you need to do. And so when it's presented as, do these 12 things, but they're not really broken down, is when it becomes confusing. And so I'm going to break down the contraction process for you, and you'll, as I'm presenting it, be thinking to yourself, well, I already know that. Well, that's kind of silly for her to go through that. But sometimes when we make it explicit, when we present in an explicit way some information that we knew but perhaps had never really thought about, it can make it clearer and help us decide exactly why we're doing what we're doing and what rule applies in a particular situation. So I want to start by saying that I realize you know all this stuff going forward. I'm not that silly. Okay, so let's talk about what is a contraction. Well, we know generally the word contraction in English means to make something stronger, to contract. For example, when we tighten a muscle, we make the muscle shorter by bringing, say, the arm to the shoulder. We're shortening the muscle in our upper arm. And while it is a word that has various meanings in English, in grammar, we usually, when we're talking about a contraction, we're really talking about a pair of two words, typically. One of those words we shrink. We take away some parts of it. And where we have shrunk the word, where we have taken away some of the sounds, that is what we contract. That's the part that goes away. So let's go through the mechanics of how to construct a contraction in English. And there's 4 steps. First of all, you need to identify a word that can be contracted, that is subject to contraction. And I'm going to give you a partial list in a couple of minutes, but most of these words you know, you don't really have to think too much about them to know, is that a contractible word or not? Then once you decided what the word is that is contractible, you smash that word together with the word that you're going to attach the contracted words to. In most cases, the contracted word is attached to the word before it in the sentence. That's the usual pattern, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on here today. There are some times where it contracts in a different way, but for the purpose of our lesson, let's just assume that we're taking the contractible word and smashing it next to the word right before it in the sentence, or to the left of it in the sentence. Now we're going to go back to that contractible word and remove the letters that we can remove, and that, of course, is what makes it a contraction. Where those letters are missing is where we put the apostrophe to show, hey, this is where we've taken out some information. It's kind of like the ellipsis marks that we have in a quotation when we remove some of the words from the quote. Okay, so all this we know. Here are some examples of contractible words. Am becomes apostrophe M. We remove the A here. So we remove this letter. We have am. Where the A was is where we put the apostrophe. R, we remove the A and we have apostrophe RE. The apostrophe replaces the A. Did, we remove the DI and we put the apostrophe where the DI is. Does, we remove the DOE, we replace it with an apostrophe. Is, we remove the I, we replace it with an apostrophe. Had, we remove the HA, we replace it with apostrophe. Has, we remove the HA, we replace it with apostrophe. Have, we remove the HA, we replace it with an apostrophe. We'll skip not for now. Us, we remove the U, we replace it with an apostrophe. Will, we remove the WI, and we replace it with an apostrophe. Would, we remove the WOUL and replace it with an apostrophe. All of these follow the exact same pattern, except for not. So let's just forget about not for a second. I'm going to pretend that not's not even here on the list. What we do is we find the vowel, A. Most of the time they start with a vowel. We find the first vowel in the word. Then we remove that vowel and everything that comes before it. So we can see how we would remove and just have the M left. We just have the R and the E left. We just have the D left. We just have, here's an addition. Once we find the first vowel and remove the first vowel and everything before it, we remove any adjacent vowels to that first vowel. And so we'd be just with the S. Here we remove the I, replace it with apostrophe. We find our first vowel A, we remove the H in front of it. Find our first vowel A, remove the H in front of it. Find our first vowel A, remove the H in front of it. Find our first vowel U. Find our first vowel I, remove the I and the W. Would, we find our O, we remove the O and the W. Oh, and we also have to remove the U, which is next door to it. All these words follow the exact same rule, except not. And not, we do find our first vowel and remove it, but we don't remove the N in front of it. So we keep the N and put the apostrophe where the O was. Okay, so here's the rule that we just described. If the word can contract, if it's a contractible word, we remove the first vowel and all letters that precede the first vowel. If the first vowel is next to another vowel, we remove that adjacent vowel as well. And then we put an apostrophe where the missing letters were. Those are the 3 steps we just talked about doing. And then that is going to reflect how we pronounce the sound in English. So when we are going to say he is, we say he's. We don't say he is. We don't ever say this sound. When it's she is, we say she's. That E sound we're hearing is from the word she. When we're saying will, I will run, or I'll run, we are removing this, and we're just keeping the I sound from the word I, and then we're adding the LL. So usually the contraction reflects how we actually pronounce it. And we talked about the exception for the word not. And here are examples of contractions in English. I am, I'm. You can see we smash the 2 words together. We find that first vowel, that's the first letter in the name, and so we remove it and replace it with an apostrophe. Here we smash we and will together. We find our first vowel in the word will, that's I, and then we also remove the letter in front of it, W, and put an apostrophe. We smash they and would together. We find our first vowel, O, we remove the letters in front of it. Oh, and next to the O we also have a U, so we remove that. Well, I guess here, this is another exception. We remove the L too, so I guess going back here, we remove the L. So that's a little bit of an exception. So in addition to the not, we have the L in would also being an exception. Doesn't, we smash these 2 together, but we find our first vowel, the O, but we keep the N. It's an exception to the rule, and we have doesn't. We smash he and had. We find our first vowel in had, which is A. We remove the letter in front of it, and we have this. And you can see the pattern. Smash these together, remove the U, put the space. Smash these together, find the A, remove the H in front of it, make an apostrophe. Smash these 2 together, find the first vowel I, remove the I and the D, and it goes forward like this. Okay, we talked about this in our last presentation, but just a reflection. This word isn't, when the word its is correctly punctuated or correctly written with the apostrophe, its can only mean it is or it has. It cannot mean because this means possessive. We talked about how when we ordinarily show possessive with nouns, we do use an apostrophe. But we don't use an apostrophe when we're showing possessiveness with pronouns. It is, of course, a pronoun, so we don't need the apostrophe. But even if we wanted to use an apostrophe, it wouldn't make sense to, because we always use an apostrophe when we are contracting a word. And the only word its, in the possessive case, the only word that it can be confused with is its, meaning the contraction it has or it is. And so if we decide one of those is going to be punctuated with an apostrophe, we ought to leave the other without an apostrophe so that we'll be able to, when we're reading it, immediately know, oh yeah, the reader meant it is or it has, or the reader meant it's in the possessive case. Because the purpose of that apostrophe is to add clarity, to remove ambiguity in the sentence. So if we're going to have a word, then in both forms of the word, we're going to use an apostrophe. We're not helping ourselves to make that clear. So we always use the apostrophe when we're making a contraction, and we use the apostrophe in the genitive case only when we're working with nouns. Okay, so and this takes us back to our point of confusion. Up to this point, you may be thinking, well, this is all lovely. I already know all this stuff. I knew this stuff when I was 4. Why are we wasting our time with it? And the reason that we spent this time is that there is a part of the contraction process that does cause confusion sometimes. And the problem is that we use that S ending in English for 3 purposes. To make most nouns plural. So if we have the word boy, but suddenly there are 2 boys, we add an S. Or let's say there's a girl, but another girl shows up, we have 2 girls, we add an S. Or let's say we have a boy, we're talking about the boy, but we want to talk about the boy's ball. Okay, well, we're going to add an apostrophe S. Or let's say, no, it's the girl's ball. We have girl, now we're going to talk about her ball. Okay, so we have apostrophe S here. And then we might have a contraction. The boy, let's say the original sentence is late for school. But what we want to do is smash is and boy together, so we're going to remove the I, and we say the boy is late for school. And so these are the 3 ways that we can have confusion. When we say this boys, and we say this boys, and we say this boys, and we say this boys, they sound identical. There's no distinction in the pronunciation in spoken English. When we write them, they do look different, though, because we have that apostrophe in the possessive and the contraction case. And so we're going to talk about how that all plays out. Okay? So now we're going to talk about, but let me give one more example. In this instance, we're saying a single boy is late for school, but let's assume that it was a whole group of boys. They walked to school together, and they were late for school. What are we going to do here? We're going to say are. The boys are late for school. The boys are late for school. We don't contract the boys are late for school. I suppose in theory you could do this, but that would seem odd to us. So we wouldn't contract it in that perspective. And so if we hear boys late for school, we know that in this context, that this is a contraction, and that it can't mean lots of boys being late for school, because we would say many boys are late for school, and we know the apostrophe S means is or has. In this context, it has to be is, so we wouldn't say lots of boys is late for school. That doesn't make sense. Anyway, so we're going to get started on how we're going to resolve this contraction problem. How are we going to tell if the word that we have is a contraction? And the best way of doing it is to uncontract the word, to go back to the words, to the contracted word's original form with 2 words. Okay, so let's say that we have a word that ends with an S. So we're going to remove that S. Let's say Bob likes Mary's dress. And we're trying to decide, was Mary a contraction? Maybe it is. So let's try to unpack it. Well, we know the apostrophe S can mean, here we have our examples. It can mean does, is, or has in English. And of course, these are the ones we need to focus on. The others, we're not going to, and can mean us, but in this context, that wouldn't apply. Because us has to start out, typically we're saying let's, let us. And so this is not a verb, this is a pronoun, obviously. So really the ones we're focusing on are does, is, and has. They're the ones that end in S. We're not going to have the problem of the confusion with the genitive case with an apostrophe M ending, for example. So we don't have to worry about that one. Okay, so we're back to Mary's dress. Bob likes Mary's dress. Well, let's try uncontracting it and replacing this apostrophe S with DOE, like that. Bob likes Mary does dress. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So now we're going to try is. So we're going to space them out and do an is. Bob likes Mary is dress. Doesn't make any sense. Has. Bob likes Mary has dress. Doesn't make sense. Actually, we did go ahead and try with it with us. Bob likes Mary us dress. None of those make sense, which tells us that we're not dealing with a contraction. If any of these sentences did make sense, then we had a contraction. But because they don't, we now can eliminate that possibility. And remember, we had three possibilities when we see a word end in S. The three main possibilities. Is it plural? Because we haven't really explored that. All we've explored is this possibility. We've concluded that the word is in a contraction. What we haven't decided is whether Mary is plural or singular, or whether Mary is possessive or not. But we have eliminated the contraction. We now know Mary's is not a contraction. If it's punctuated correctly, if it really should have this apostrophe, then we know that it's in possessive form. Of course, if we're not sure about the if we're not sure about the punctuation, then we'll want to consider that a little bit in more detail. Let's look at another example. Mary's happy to go to the party. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to expand the apostrophe S to Mary does happy to go to the party. That doesn't sound right. We'll go back here. So now we're going to remove the apostrophe. Mary is happy to go to the party. Well, that does make sense, right? Mary has happy to go to the party? No, that doesn't sound good. Mary us happy to go to the party? Doesn't sound good. But because this does make sense, we know that Mary is a contraction of Mary, the word Mary, and the word is. And so the reason that we have the apostrophe here is not because it's in the genitive case, it's because it's a contraction. So you may be wondering, why do we in English use contractions? What is the purpose of a contraction? Well, typically it's to make something easier and quicker to say. To say, Mary is happy. Doesn't take a long time, but Mary's happy is quicker. We've eliminated a syllable. See, we have Mary is happy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 syllables. Now we have Mary's happy. We have 4 syllables. And we eliminated a sound. So it's a little quicker to say. Also, contractions create an informal tone, and sometimes that's a desirable thing. If you have ever noticed somebody who does not speak in contractions at all, it sounds kind of artificial and formal and not very natural. And it's likely to make you feel a little uncomfortable, even if you are not sure why you are feeling uncomfortable. So it is a way to make people feel more at ease. It creates a feeling of relationships between people. Well, so that's a desirable thing in most spoken English. I guess there are times where that may not be desirable. If you're, for example, arguing before the Supreme Court, you probably don't want to sound too informal. But in everyday conversation and even in more formal conversation, contractions are appropriate and nice and effective ways of communicating in English. They are not, however, effective or appropriate in written English, and especially not in legal writing. So when you see a contraction in legal writing, you need to expand it. The only time you ought to have a contraction in legal writing is when you are quoting something that already had a contraction in it. And even then, many times people will expand the contraction. And that's for a separate presentation, how you go about doing that. You certainly don't have to, but you shouldn't have any contractions. You should not have any contractions when you are writing in any papers in a legal class. You know, people sometimes have a little bit more of a flexible idea if they are sending emails or text messages. Certainly if they are with people within your own office, I think a contraction would be okay. Certainly when you're corresponding with friends, obviously a contraction's fine. But just be sure and err on the side of formality in this sense. Anything other than a contraction, anything other than an email definitely should have the words fully written out. And another reason that contractions are disfavored, in addition to the fact that it's an informal tone, is that sometimes it can lead to ambiguity. Did you mean this particular word or this particular word? And if you have written the whole word out, then you've removed that potential for confusion. I've already kind of covered this, but let's go over this for a second. Okay, so we shouldn't use contractions at all. And in fact, I encourage you in your Word document, in your Word setup, to have contractions as one of those labeled areas where when you're going through your revision checklist and you're having the grammar check and the spell check, that it will actually identify all the contractions you have in there. And you can also do a find using the apostrophe key to find all of your apostrophes. Now, of course, you'll want to keep the apostrophes that are there because of the genitive case, but you'll want to eliminate all other apostrophes unless it's somebody's name like O'Connor or somebody's name that has an apostrophe in it. So be sure to eliminate those. It's an easy way to score some extra points on an assignment in a legal writing course because it's an easy fix to do. You don't have to be a good legal writer to be able to identify a contraction, and it can be a way to get some points back. Okay. So, best practice is speak but don't write contractions. Now I'm going to return to something. I know I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating. Most of us have different styles of speaking and different styles of writing depending upon our audience and our purpose. That's appropriate, that's smart, that's intelligent, that's a good strategy to have. But when we're learning a new strategy, it's sometimes helpful to really focus on that new strategy and put aside our other strategies, at least for a time being, so we can really cement our understanding of that first strategy. So while you may routinely use contractions when you're sending emails and texts, it may be a good idea for the purposes of this course to have a no contractions policy and just to kind of every time you have a contraction, say, oh, I'm not doing that. And that way you'll intentionally be reinforcing this skill set. At this point, we're going to close down this lecture, and I thank you for your attention, and we will continue in another lecture, probably just one more lecture. Thanks. Bye-bye.